start. Oh, boy. Much better. All right, can you hear me okay? On behalf of the Akron Press Club, the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics, and the University of Akron Conn Law Center, I would like to welcome you all here today to hear the keynote speech, kicking off our half-day symposium on the 25th Amendment. And I wanted to welcome Professor Ornstein here, as well as 6 other very high-profile scholars that know a little bit about the 25th Amendment who are going to be partaking in the rest of the afternoon's events. A little bit about our keynote speaker. Norman Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., where he studies politics, elections in the U.S. Congress. He's a co-host of AEI's Election Watch series, a contributing editor and columnist for National Journal and The Atlantic, a BBC News election analyst, and chairman of the Campaign Legal Center. He is also a commentator on numerous networks and in numerous national and international media outlets. If you haven't seen Norm commentating on politics recently, you haven't been watching much television or reading, many large newspapers. He's a longtime observer and analyst of American politics and the U.S. Congress. He has been involved in political reform for decades, particularly campaign finance reform and the reform of Senate committees. He's also played a part in creating the Congressional Office of Compliance and the House Office of Congressional Ethics. He's also written numerous books, only one of which I'll mention today, and that's his latest, One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. And that is with E.J. Dionne and Tom Mann. It was published in 2017 and still available. Would make a wonderful Valentine's Day gift. Just Dr. Ornstein earned a PhD and a master's in political science from the University of Michigan and a BA from the University of Minnesota, so he is very used to the wonderful weather that we're having in Akron today. And in closing, there are few people who know as much about American politics as Dr. Ornstein does, and we are so very fortunate to have him here with us today at the Akron Press Club and on the campus of the University of Akron. So without further ado, here's Dr. Ornstein.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks for mentioning the book. Let me add, it would also make a great gift for weddings, bar mitzvahs, brisses, christenings, any holiday. So today is day 735 of the Trump presidency, or as he says, longer than any other president. It's also day 37 of the government shutdown, and once the shutdown got over 30, Democrats thought he'd lose interest. And actually, I have to say, confess to one error. When Trump got elected, many of my friends were very distressed. I said, "Don't worry, he won't be there long. He'll leave us for a younger country." I was wrong. Of course, now we have this tremendous confrontation between the president and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Trump has gotten so upset at Pelosi that he offered her $130,000 to stay quiet. And of course, with the shutdown, things have gotten so bad that Air Force One is now being run by Spirit Airlines. Like to get you laughing because it's all downhill. I want to say to start with that I'm delighted to be here at this great university, but also under the auspices of the Press Club. And this has been a very tough week for journalism. We were talking about it a little bit at the table. We have layoffs in a number of places, including some that have been doing reasonably well. I actually, as I got on the plane to come here, was reading a series of tweets from a journalism professor sort of detailing over the years the decline of journalism and the causes for it, suggesting, among other things, that it went back long before Craig Newmark created Craigslist. but the struggles that we've seen and that we continue to see. And I'm particularly honored to be here because the Akron Beacon Journal, I believe, is one of the best regional papers in the country, has been for a long time, and continues to provide quality journalism. So to be with people who are party to that, it's something we need very much. And as I see some of these journalistic entities get rid of their regional reporters, I see even the top flight newspapers like the New York Times pulling out of the state houses and doing almost none of the local and regional coverage, places where it's most necessary, because that's where corruption festers. It's a distressing development. It's not the topic for today, but I wanted to weigh in on it. Now, we have a symposium on the 25th Amendment, and we have, as Dave suggested, the best people here to talk about it. We have John Feerick, who really was the father of this amendment, and when you look at it in detail, where it went, how it was considered, and how it was passed, the nuances, the difficulty of juggling things, and finding ways to make it through. Working with a master legislator, Birch Bayh, it was really special, and it's special that he's here. And having Joel Goldstein, my friend, who has written the best histories of this amendment and a lot of the details, and then my friend Harold Coe, who along with his law students really published the go-to guide for every element of the amendment to consider in the contemporary period, and so many others. This is really a classic event. So I'm not going to talk about those elements of the 25th Amendment and their relevance right now. I want to move beyond that to talk about other challenges that we continue to face, and the questions of presidential legitimacy, presidential succession, and the questions that are there in the years and decades since the 25th Amendment about where we might go when we face challenges that weren't really considered much before. So the first thing I want to talk about is a reality. It may not be our reality, we don't know for sure, but what do we do if there's an election that's not a legitimate election? What do we do if we have an election that is either decided because a foreign power put the thumb on the scales, or because there's corruption at another level? And the fundamental reality is we don't have a do-over provision in the Constitution. We don't have the ability to step back and say, whoops, we need to reconsider this. And while that's not going to happen in terms of changing things in the foreseeable future, it's something we have to think about. And as I'll discuss in a few minutes, it's something we have to think about in broader context as well. Now, I will make the case that we could build in a do-over provision without having a new constitutional amendment. Because the Constitution says there's a president and a vice president, and it gives Congress the authority to set the line of succession after that if there's a vacancy or if there are other issues there. And we've had over history 3 presidential succession acts. We know that reconsidering the succession process was something that was very much on the mind of Birch Bayh when the 25th Amendment was considered, and for a lot of very practical reasons, we did not see that major change take place. As I'll suggest in a little while, when I made a major push to change what is a deeply flawed Presidential Succession Act passed in 1947, I wasn't able to get any traction either through the Bush administration or the Obama administration. But I think that there are possibilities with a Presidential Succession Act that now, as most people are familiar with, says that after a president and vice president, the Speaker of the House is next in line if that Speaker resigns from his or her office, followed by the President pro tem of the Senate, followed by the Cabinet in order of succession with a modest adjustment when the Department of Homeland Security was created. But I don't see any reason why you couldn't suggest that you could alter that line of succession so that when there are vacancies, you could have an election to determine the successors. Now, that would be maybe a tough battle to win over with this Supreme Court, but it's at least something worth considering. And we have to consider a reality now, not just with what we know are the very deep, deliberate, widespread, and successful attempts by Russia to interfere in our election and to foment deep distress within the political system. Something they're continuing to do now that isn't just focused on elections, but focused on dividing Americans even more through bots and through other mechanisms. But we also know that the Chinese, among other things, have invested a lot of money and used their best and brightest to dig deeply into our not just political process, but commercial processes as well. And the opening, the possibility of interfering in our elections is greater than it has been, and we have to think about possibilities. Not just how do we build better election security, which is an important element of this, but whether there are other mechanisms we need to consider. Now I want to step back for a few minutes and deal more broadly with this set of issues, also because of the way things have changed. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, I was on my way to Dulles Airport, actually to take a flight to Norfolk, Virginia, to meet with government ethics officers at their annual convention. And I was driving with the top down. It was just a spectacularly beautiful day. And when I got to the airport, there were televisions. Everybody was abuzz because one plane had hit the World Trade Center. And the speculation was that it was some little private plane that had just gone astray. And by the time I got down to the gate and was on the jetway going to board my plane, when they pulled us back, because it happened to be 2 gates down from the plane headed to Tokyo that ended up hitting the Pentagon. The second plane had hit the World Trade Center, and it was clear it was something more distressing than that. And I retrieved my car and I drove home. My office mate said, "Don't go downtown." And by early afternoon, I realized something else. I had a kind of epiphany. I knew once we saw what happened to United 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania, that if that plane had not taken off 45 minutes late from Newark, that the passengers on board would not have known that they were on a suicide mission. And I believe firmly that it was headed for the Capitol Dome. Now, I'd spent a lot of time in the mornings around the Capitol, and I knew that this was a day when most of the members would be there. And there'd be a lot of them outside on the lawn. You know, they would set up cameras, they'd do little press events, or they'd have groups of people on the steps. There'd be a lot of people inside in their offices, and some on the floor, even though they were just doing morning business. But I knew that if a fully loaded with fuel, large passenger jet hit the cast iron dome of the Capitol, mayhem would ensue, and very possibly we would have a majority of the members of the House at least either dead or missing. And the Constitution says that a quorum requires half of the members of the institution. And we wouldn't have a Congress. Now, at the same time, the only way we replace members of the House of Representatives is by special election. And special elections took, on average, 4 to 5 months. So what went through my head was, what's going to happen if, at this critical moment in American life, we don't have a Congress for 4 or 5 months? We would have the equivalent of martial law. And that's not a good development. Of course, in the end, all the members of Congress ended up just a day later on the steps of the Capitol singing "God Bless America" and sending a signal to the world that we were bloodied but unbowed. And then we had a series of legislative actions, including the Patriot Act, that got at least slowed a little bit and changed slightly to make it happen. So I wrote a piece, a column, a few days later, saying we don't have any provisions in place to deal with emergencies of this sort for any of the branches of government. It turns out, by coincidence, that morning, the Supreme Court building, a stone's throw from the Capitol, was having a meeting of the Judicial Conference of the United States. And so the core of the American federal judiciary, Supreme Court justices, appeals court judges, and so on, were there in a place where debris from that kind of attack could have devastated things as well. It's a funny little story that emerges from that, which is that while they were meeting, presided over by Chief Justice Rehnquist, a number of people kept going up to him and whispering his ear and then leaving and then coming back to him. And in the middle of the meeting, he just stood up and left with them. Didn't say anything to the other judges who were there. Of course, he was spirited off to an undisclosed location, leaving them to their own devices. But as soon as I wrote my piece, I was contacted by Brian Baird, a congressman from the state of Washington, who said, as I was there in the chaos in the Capitol, because we didn't know what to do, the same thing occurred to me. And eventually we created a continuity of government commission that focused first on Congress. We had co-chairs Lloyd Cutler, the double White House counsel, a distinguished lawyer, and Alan Simpson, a former senator from Wyoming and former deputy leader of his own party in the Senate, and a lot of members from across the political and academic and other arenas. And while we focused on congressional succession at first, we then moved on to presidential succession, looking at the flaws in that presidential succession act. And I should note that if you look at the history of the country, we've had many times in the past where we had enormous gaps and problems, including times when we had no vice president and no Congress around, and really the possibility of chaos ensuing. But it took multiple tragedies or near tragedies for the government to act to make changes to try and deal with some of those issues, including assassinations of presidents, which led to different presidential succession acts and the like. And what brought the 1947 Act about was, as President Harry Truman and his Secretary of State Stettinius were traveling to Potsdam in the aftermath of the war, a very dangerous time, they realized that we didn't really have a very good succession plan, and so rewrote that law. But that law, which has members of Congress in the line of succession, and that means basically, first of all, people who I believe are there unconstitutionally. They're not officers of the United States, and Madison felt that way as well. But also, you could end up with a Speaker of the House or a President pro tem of the Senate, somebody chosen because that person is the most senior member of the majority party. And the prospect of, before this year, Orrin Hatch stepping into the presidency or Charles Grassley doesn't inspire a lot of confidence that we would have steady leadership at the helm of the country. Or a Speaker of the House who might be from the opposite party or might not provide the right legitimacy. But the reality is every member in the line of succession resides in Washington, and a catastrophe could leave us headless. So we worked through all of that and suggested some changes that haven't taken place. But we moved on from there to also recognize the vulnerability in our elections for which we have no answers. So, what happens, for example, if there is a terrorist attack or a cyber terror effort to disrupt an election? What happens if somebody knocks off the electrical grid in one part of the United States on election day? And let's say the Northeast can't vote. One, very possibly, you're going to have an election in which nobody then is going to be able to get a majority of electoral votes, sending the election to the House of Representatives, where they vote by state, 50 votes, and where you're going to have a result determined not by the will of the people, but also by who dominates small states. And majorities don't matter under those circumstances either. Are you going to have those states vote at a subsequent point? On 9/11, they were actually having a mayoral election primary in New York, and they postponed the election. That worked out fine. It's not the same thing if you try and postpone a federal election, especially a presidential election, and then if you have one part of the country voting after they know the results in the other parts of the country. That's not going to work very well. Now we have an additional set of issues, as climate change has created not only more violent storms, but ones later in the cycle than we normally get. So right before, actually several weeks before this midterm election, we had a devastating hurricane that hit the panhandle of Florida and knocked out a good part of that area of Florida for a significant period of time. It occurred long enough before the election that they were able to recover, have people able to move back into their homes or at least into temporary places while they waited for the repairs on their homes. They were able to get the electrical grid back up and working in the area. They were able to have all the polling places available. But imagine if we had a Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane occurring several days before the election that could wipe out any possibility of holding an election in, say, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida. We have no way of dealing with that. Now, I don't have an easy answer for how we deal with it. We need latter-day equivalents of John Feerick and Birch Bayh to sit down with others and think about what we would do under those circumstances. But the fact that we have no protection in place for events that are more and more possible and palpable in this day and age ought to give us pause. And frankly, the fact that while we had a powerful commission with a lot of members, and we focused as well on the continuity of the Supreme Court, where the only thing we have is a statutory requirement of a quorum of 6. What happens if the court goes out at a time when you might need to have a resolution of issues of presidential succession or whether Congress is appropriately reconstituted to have a quorum? And you don't want to have a bunch of appeals courts having alternate rulings about this. But all of those suggestions that we made for revamping Congress, which would mean having temporary appointments until the Congress could get back up and running, and having a different presidential succession process with at least some people in the line outside of Washington who are appropriate for it, and frankly, taking out of the line of succession many cabinet members who don't get chosen because they would be appropriate if bad things happen to step into the presidency, but for a whole set of other considerations that may make them inappropriate. And they're not Kiefer Sutherland. Much less the Supreme Court, but nobody acted. Now that's not just a function of our times, as I've suggested. There's an enormous inertia there. And there's also this sense that all of us have seen, if you know people who are smart and capable and don't write a will, because they're superstitious, that it might actually encourage the possibility that it will be needed sooner rather than later, and because some of the difficult issues you have to deal with, like who will have custody of the kids, will have to be my relatives. I wouldn't trust them with our children. They're going to be mine. Those issues you just want to put off, but then you leave it to chance if something happened that could create horrible trauma within your family. And it's the same thing in the political arena. So thank God we have the 25th Amendment, and that it was enacted at a point where it could be used, and used effectively a couple of times, and might prove to be useful effectively sometime in the foreseeable future as well. But we have many other issues to consider on the table, things that the framers could not possibly have thought about, things that people in the 50s and 60s and 70s would not have thought about, but that people in this century have to. And with that, I'm going to stop and open it up for questions or comments.